Well, hello. I'm here with a new acquaintance, soon to be a friend, Jean Eells, who I met when I was on one of the calls with the Iowa Farmers Union group that I listen in on. I'm not a farmer, as many of you know, but I am definitely interested in learning about how someone would be a good steward of the land. It's as they say, they're not making any more of it. So
right.
Anyway, thanks for coming, Jean. And I really just, after meeting you at the talk that you did for those folks, I wanted to share it with people that might be interested, that I communicate with periodically. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how you got into it, what it is that you're doing, how it's going. Like there must be more people that are getting involved as time goes on. And
Great fun. Yes.
Yeah. So really, however you'd like to answer those
Sure.
questions, or just speak about whatever you'd like to talk about.
Sounds good. Well, I grew up on a small farm in Iowa. It's kind of an old McDonald's farm with a little, chickens, hogs, cattle, a little bit of everything. And it ended up where after our parents passed away, I'm co-sharing the land with my siblings. I went into conservation work, so I did a lot of field trips with school children and nature interpretation, and that was kind of my entry into the conservation world. And so I did a lot with wildlife habitat, prairie, woodlands, the whole 9 yards of basic conservation work. And in about 2002, 2003, I went to a conference where I learned that women owned half the farmland in Iowa. And I was kind of like, what?
Yeah.
Because when it comes to conservation, and I was already a soil and water conservation district commissioner, and we didn't see women's names associated with conservation practices nearly at the rate you might expect if women are half the landowners. And it doesn't matter how you slice it, half the landowners and owning half the land. That's the numbers that we have in Iowa. And we find that those are kind of true for certainly the Corn Belt states and Midwestern states, but the numbers hold across the nation too, and it makes sense. We're half the population. Yeah, that's not a surprise. So when I learned that, and as a commissioner, we sign off on the CRP folders that are applications, whether it's new applications or renewals. And I sat there one time and we had 50 applications for renewals, and out of 50 folders, and they all have the landowner's name on them, there were 3 women's names. 3. I went through 2 cycles of that, 50 folders, 3 women's names. I thought, where are they? Because their land is not substantively different. It's kind of all the same around here. And so that sent me on to a research project to figure out, where were they? Why weren't they participating at the same rates? And it's been an interesting journey ever since then. Certainly looking at all kinds of conservation activities, I find the same pattern. And that is that women are often, because of the way we've designed programs and designed programs in any way you want to interpret the word program, kind of made women feel unwelcome. Like this is not for me. It's not meant for me. And we hear that over and over in the outreach. And when we start working with women specifically, we hear that from them very frequently, that they didn't think it was meant for them. They felt isolated. They didn't know any other women cared about the same stuff, etc. So they just didn't have conversation partners to talk to about their conservation interests. And once we started opening up the floodgates, they're really excited about participating, but we have to reach them, and they're still very hard to reach. So I thank you for this opportunity to speak to some folks who may not have heard about how this all unwraps and how it rolls. So when I say we, a lot of times I'm referring to not only my small company, which is me, and then sometimes I have some very interesting subcontractors, but I also subcontract myself to other organizations. And one where I've done a lot of work is an organization called Women, Food and Agriculture Network, and they're nationwide. I've done some work with American Farmland Trust folks. We have partnered with people who do conservation across the nation, various places. And there are women's programs in most states for agriculture, but they don't always include conservation. And that's one of the things that makes Women, Food and Agriculture Network programs different. They have a program that I've been associated with. It's called Women Caring for the Land. And it's always only about conservation and agriculture in some way, shape, or form. So it could be grassland birds, it could be wetlands, it could be land transitioning, which doesn't sound like it would be a conservation thing, except how do you pass the land forward and retain the conservation values that you have. And so that is kind of a unique window into this world of doing outreach for women. We've certainly learned a lot about reaching women with conservation messages. And one of the things that we've done is look at the marketing materials. Mm-hmm. And this is an easy grab. If you stand in the grocery store checkout line and you're looking at the magazines and you look and you say, oh, these are meant for women. And you just kind of instinctively, you don't even look twice, and you see the ones that are meant for men or people of a special interest niche, you know, and the images, the colors, the fonts, everything matches the audience that it's intended to reach. Well, think about our conservation publications. They're all some version of green and blue and brown and brown and green and blue and brown and blue and yellow and green and not much that says, hey, this is something meant for you if you're a woman. Now, that doesn't mean that we're looking for tokenism and, you know, everything has to be a certain color palette. But it does need to communicate that, yeah, I will find something interesting, something that's written at a level I can understand, that's meant for me. It's written to my perspective and includes the interests that I have. And it doesn't mean that that's exclusive. In some cases, it can be the same content, and most times it can be just written from a little different perspective, but laid out so you'd want to look at it. So it's bright and beautiful and makes you feel good when you read it. So just thinking about what we know about market segmentation and what marketers have done, the last person you want in charge of your conservation publication is a conservationist, because we're going to pick something that's green and blue and brown and green and blue. Yeah, nothing wrong with those colors. Just, you know, there's a difference, and you can see it when you're in the grocery store checkout line. It's pretty plain. Of course, I'm the opposite. So I'm one of those people that, you know, I'm looking for those conservation publications and I'm not looking at the other stuff, but all of a sudden you start to realize that those of us that are interested in conservation are kind of over here. And there's a whole population curve, you know, a bell-shaped curve. And we're kind of at one end or the other, whichever end you want to put us on. And there's a lot more people that need to join us to make a difference and make clean water and clean air happen. And sometimes they just don't know how those things happen. Water that isn't clean, or air that isn't clean, or soil that is staying in place? How does that happen? How do we keep it where it should go? So having those conversations, there's a lot of very sophisticated information about soil health, but it's really simple and easy to understand once you've talked to somebody about it. And so we've got women that are jumping on board and making changes once we talk to them plainly and have a great conversation. So that's kind of the work that I do. And for me, it's always, always, always about the conservation, increasing people's ability to participate, increasing their thinking about what can I do? Is my land being used for in such a way that it produces clean water, that clean water flows through the ground and reaches the stream and is clean and healthy, so that wildlife that depends on it and doesn't have a vote, that other people who are needing that water, so drinking water sources, etc., all of that's going to be coming from our lands. And as land owners, not necessarily the farmers, but as land owners, we need to be part of that conversation. And that brings me to a really important distinction, and that is that I'm talking about women who own land and aren't necessarily farmers or closely involved with the ag production in some way. And many of us have been educators, insurance agents, nurses, teachers. There's a whole list of things that women have done that hasn't had anything to do with agriculture. And maybe through inheritance, maybe through purchases, we've found ourselves owning land. And how do you take care of that land? And what can you say? And how much can you ask for? And where does the line get drawn as far as what kind of a lease you have? Does that mean you can't have this, or you can't ask for that if you have this kind of lease or that kind of lease? So there's a lot of mystery out there and a lot of myths about what you can and can't do when it comes to conservation. And you can, in fact, ask for conservation practices if you're cash renting. There's a big myth. People think, oh, cash rent, I don't have the rights to ask for anything.
Yeah, there's a little video on your website. Maybe it was the Nature Conservatory thing that you had shared with me. And the woman, she didn't really know much about it, but once she knew about it, boy, she held on, and really sounded really good that she got up in the combine with the farmer, and this is her land, although they're leasing it, I guess, is the way, or renting it, whatever.
Yeah.
And she got involved about how to care for the land. And that
makes a big difference. Yeah. It's and once they learn the things that they can do and need to be done, and learn how to check their own land and check their own soil, things change. And they know they can ask better questions. They can ask, wow, we've got this going on. How shall we fix it? It's a we instead of you. Yeah. And what's your responsibility and what's my responsibility as a landowner? How do we do this together? Because we need to address this problem. Changes the whole dynamic. It's not a us versus them. That's not the approach we're taking.
Right.
We're taking it saying, identify what's going on with your land. Go out and check the water. If you have underground tile that drains the land, see if you can figure out testing that tile water, because that tells you a lot about what's coming through your land into the pipelines that are underneath and out into the streams. It tells you a lot about whether you're contributing clean water or you're contributing to the problem. And then you can start saying, okay, if that's a problem, how can we start to fix this? Or if you've got compaction problems that the farmer is struggling with. You may not even know what they're struggling with if you don't have that conversation.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that can make a big difference too.
Yeah, and because of our where we are in a generation, I'll call it, in terms of baby boomers, there is a massive, I got to believe here in the Midwest, with all the farmland that spreads across the Midwest, that there is a huge amount of land that's getting transferred.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
like, I know just from a financial standpoint, that's going on too, all over the country, New York
Yeah.
City,
Exactly.
wealth is being transferred because people are getting older and passing away, and you may not know until you might be completely and unsuspecting that you're going to inherit 500 acres or 100 acres or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Or even 40 acres. And I'm like, oh my gosh, now what do I do?
Yeah. And you may never have ever set foot on that property.
Right.
Before. So
it's not uncommon. It is not uncommon. We had a meeting in Illinois. I still remember the lady that came. And when we hold our meetings, we're in a circle and we take the time to go around and do a deep introduction so that we know who's here. How can we, can I ask questions or not? But we want to know and whose circumstances there are, because that's just the way we roll. So we spend the time to do that. And this woman started out and then she kind of choked up. She said, well, I inherited 2 farms from my mother. And then 2 years later, her sister died and I inherited 2 more farms.
oh boy.
And of course, some of us are eyes just bugging out. And she said, and then her other sister died and I inherited 2 more farms. I have 6 farms to manage. I know nothing about agriculture. This is my first meeting about any of this. And everybody was just, kind of like in tears because she was sobbing. Everybody was grabbing Kleenex and said, okay, here we go. Let's bond. Let's keep going. And by the end of the day, she was like, when's the next meeting? She was all smiles. And, she recognized that there was a community of women who would help. And here are some resources. And we taught her enough about how to go out and check her own soil to see whether it's degraded or not. She was like, I can do this. And it makes a big difference. And that was within one day. So we know women are hungry for the information. And if we want conservation to happen, if we want to improve water, if we want to make sure the soil is resilient for generations to come, and I'm telling you what, it's not right now. If we want that to be resilient, we need everybody. And instead, we've done a lot of conservation with one arm tied behind our back because we haven't been reaching women. We haven't allowed them to do what they can do. Can they fix everything? No. Can men fix everything? No. But there's a whole lot more that could join us and join the effort to improve that soil for future generations. And it makes a big difference, but it takes some time. And you're right. When I think about the outreach that we do in conservation, we kind of make it sound sciencey. It's all about the, vertical structure and this kind of stuff. And we toss out habitat terms and all, and we talk soil and water conservation and it's all about this and that. Well, I can tell you there's a lot of women my age for whom there was no STEM education. That was not a thing. So I went into science, but I was an anomaly in my class. There were like 3 of us, if you count nursing, that went into some science, and the rest didn't. It was other things that were needed, but science and such wasn't an option for most of us. So when we make our conservation conversations sound real sciencey, we make it sound like it's only meant for men, because that only men do science, and only men do conservation, and only men do farming, and It's nothing against the fact we need men doing those things. Yes.
Yes,
We
absolutely.
also need women doing them. And how do we make that happen, especially for the women who own the land or are inheriting it? And you're exactly right, Ray. The baby boomer generation is inheriting this tremendous wealth. And some places, and each state has slightly different laws and protections, but some places we see that being bought by people who are only interested in investing. Now, I have nothing against investors. Many times I hear that the investors are pushing for percentage gains through their rental that are unrealistic and not compatible with regenerating the soil. And we have a lot of degraded soil out there, a lot of degraded soil that's not going to function very well going forward as we have wild climate variations. As long as we've got wild weather, we're going to have increasing problems growing crops and getting a crop. And so it doesn't matter whether you're looking at profits or yield or food. We have to have this conversation about soil health and start regenerating that soil by looking at the practices that we're doing. And we know how to do it. It's not like, oh gosh, what are we going to do? We don't know what to do. We know what to do, and it's possible, and it's shareable, and it's profitable. The farmers that are working with things like cover crops, no-till, regenerative practices in whatever part of the world that you live in, they're finding them to be more profitable because they're not spending money on inputs that they don't need. And they're regenerating the soil function. And I tell you what, when the women we work with find out that it's possible to do that with fewer inputs, they're all about this because they see it as a way that they can help their farmers stay in business. We want them to be profitable. How am I going to charge rent if they're not making a profit? Okay.
Right. Yeah.
It doesn't have to be that quite that greedy, but I mean, you do want your farmer to stay profitable. You love their family. You know, they may be neighbors. They may be old family friends. You may go to a church with his mother.
Right.
So you don't want to be the one out there that's wringing every last bit out there, which investors kind of are doing because they're putting pressures on farmers that's making that margin ever narrower.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you what, having lived through that farm crisis time period, right?
Yep.
A margin that's this narrow, it's what I call the suicide zone, because that's what happens. The margins get too narrow. So if here's the price of corn, or here's the price of corn. If all your inputs add up to a very narrow margin, if you can do anything to push those inputs costs down, all of a sudden you got some breathing room, and your farmers are healthier, your farm families are healthier. There's a lot less stress all the way to go around. Is it a little scary to take on something new? Yeah. And that's where, again, the women landowners, and you know this from being in finances,
yeah,
women play the long game. We're good long-term investors,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that's been known in banking and financial circles for a long time. So why not help women learn what can be done and how to help their farmers, how to change that conversation, how to support that transition. And it's great fun. So we have, I don't know, there's programs all around the nation. Women Food and Agriculture Network has several different programmatic areas, but Women Caring for the Land is the one that is definitely about conservation. And depending on the funding and the grants that they have any given times, you know, sometimes they're able to do a lot of workshops and sometimes they have a lower number.
Yeah.
And that's where I jumped in and said, at this age and stage in my career, I'm kind of tired of writing grants. It's not that I won't do it, but it's just like, I'm going to do some workshops because I've got some ideas of topics and ways of holding virtual meetings that can be very engaging. And so at this point, the pandemic dragged me kicking and screaming out of in-person meetings, which was my stock and trade, into virtual meetings. And once I learned it can be okay, you can do this. Then I started offering this last year some virtual workshops. So I have women who get on who are in Connecticut, Idaho, I try to pick some times that, like you, that people can get on or tune in it when they want to.
Yeah.
And so next week, February 14, 15, 16, and 17, each day, I have some workshops going that are meant for landowners. Now, this series is open to women and men. Most of the time, my meetings are only women because they feel safer asking questions when there isn't a man present.
Yeah.
Nothing against the men, love them all, got very kind, generous men, but women just will sometimes clam up. And so I usually hold meetings for women only, but this series, I'd had some requests. We'll see if people are interested or not. But this will be women and men. And these are best when they're people that haven't necessarily done a lot with agriculture. So think about, siblings, they've inherited the land. And so she's trying to co-manage with her brother. And who gets along with their brothers anyway? I do, but by the same token, they can be kind of different. So, or spouses, all of a sudden somebody's, inherited land, and what do we do? How do we manage these relationships? So, regenerative agriculture isn't just about regenerating the soil. It's also about regenerating relationships with your land and with your farmer. And so,
and with your neighbors.
Yeah, exactly. They're your neighbors. And it's amazing how easily you can change the kind of conversation you have about farming. And women have transformed the relationship they have with their farmers just by learning to ask some different questions, coming at it from a different angle. And it's wonderful. I did a meeting for women some years back, and the woman who had me come in to host, hosted the meeting, said she met with her board about a month later, and the curmudgeon of the group came up, and she thought, uh-oh. And he said, that meeting you had a month ago? She said, yeah. Said, well, my wife came to it. And she came back from that meeting, and we sat down at the kitchen table and talked about farming for the first time in 40 years. I want to thank you for having that meeting.
Wow.
So you can transform the relationship through conversation when you know what to ask and how to ask and what goes with what.
Wow. That's saying something.
It's saying something. And it happens.
That opened up a whole other dimension to their relationship as a husband and wife.
Exactly.
It was he, right?
It was he. Yeah.
Yeah. He must have been so happy.
Yeah. Yeah. To have her asking new questions. They'd always been part of the farm. I don't know. A lot of times the women do the books or do, take an active role. So they're really active farm partners, but not doing this, or this. And so to have her open up and start asking questions about, where do we have erosion and what are we doing and how do we how are you addressing that? Tell me what you're doing, because I don't understand it all. Changes everything, it's
Yeah,
great.
that's
And
wonderful.
what could we do more of? So you never know when somebody's going to open up the pocketbook and make something happen that you didn't think was going to be possible.
Mm,
So
yeah.
I'll give myself as an example on that one. My farmer and I had agreed that we were going to try an experiment with the cover crops, where we were going to roll or crimp down the cover crop, which means to flatten it, and then you wouldn't have to spray it to kill it. But we needed to experiment and try it in a kind of a safe environment. So we had the land ready in the fall. We had a roller crimper lined up, a piece of equipment lined up to do this. And we got all the way up to spring when we was ready to do that. And it was within like 2 months. And I said, do we have it lined up? And he said, yeah, let me check. And the company had sold them and they weren't going to do it anymore. And so we were without a roller crimpers. Boy, were we on the phone really fast. And all of a sudden it was like, uh-oh. So I bought a roller crimper. I said, I can do this. It wasn't that expensive. I said, let me just buy it. We did it. We were able to do it. And so you never know when somebody else can make something happen as part of the relationship that, it's just a matter of opening up your thinking on what's possible and how could we do this together? And that's the real big deal.
How can we collaborate to make this better?
Right.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful way to have a conversation, even with somebody with whom you didn't expect that kind of cooperation.
Yeah. Right. When you were talking about land and / farming, it made me think of this gentleman that actually kind of, without knowing it, because I actually never met him. He passed away just before I found out about this particular tool that I share with people in the financial world. But he had actually studied to become a forester. And so I was thinking when you were talking about that, was that there's all kinds of farming, if you will,
Absolutely.
like you could say there's farming, fish farming, turtle farming, and then there's forests to be managed, and then I was thinking about in the investors that you were talking about, I'm with you that I'm nothing. I love investors because they keep the money moving, which keeps things happening. And they're generally looking for things that they know they're going to make a profit on.
Totally get it.
So no malinvestment, so to speak.
Right.
But I was thinking that they want to, you're saying that they like to wring out the profits, and that certain ones probably do. But when you invest in a piece of land, it's like you said, the women see it as a long term, because you should not try to wring out every possible dime out of it, because you're depleting the future.
Right.
And this gentleman used to talk about that in his forestry years, how he would show people, this is how you have to do this. And over time, meaning it could be anywhere from 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And he was thinking out 100 years. Eventually in the forest, you get it set up so well that it becomes a cash machine.
Absolutely.
And generationally over and over. And you don't necessarily get more trees out of the same space because it needs the sunlight and all this, but it's consistent.
Yes.
And sufficient. And what's the other word? Efficient.
Very efficient. Foresters often look at things and they'll have 300-year plans running in their heads, 300 and 500-year plans for forestry.
Yeah.
And absolutely, it's, the rate of gain on managed woodlands, you're going to get 14% just like that, because because the rate of the growth of the trees and that value that is added, but you have to manage them and you have to know what you're doing. It's not just benign neglect.
Right.
There are some things to do, but having that long-term view, and it is across the board. There are farmers that are gathering all winter long for workshops, both in person and virtual. I loved it when it was all virtual because I got to sit in on conferences I could never travel to, time-wise. But they're all over who are leading the way in terms of some real out-of-the-box thinking, and they're being very transparent about what they're doing. They're sharing their mistakes. They're saying, oh, I did this, and boy, was that ever a mess. But they're doing it with small bits of land. And I think that's a real easy takeaway. Whatever you're going to do that you're going to try changing, try it on a small number of acres, whatever is small in your world. So if you have 160 acre farm, try something on 20 acres, 10 acres if you have to. Do you have all the equipment? No, but you can probably rent it. You might find somebody that has a piece of equipment that'll custom farm that little bit of 20. There are a lot of creative ways of putting an experiment out there that you can watch. You don't always have to have it out by the road. I had my farmer do a wide row corn experiment, 1 acre for me. And I said, you don't have to do it out by the road. I said, you can bury it in the field. As far as I'm concerned, that's just fine.
Yeah.
So we did it and it was great.
Yeah.
So let me just mention a little bit more about the workshops, because I will continue to have these as part of my e-resources group business. That's my business name. Even though I do a lot of work with Women Food and Ag Network, I'm doing these on my own with their support. So they're helping to kind of co-promote and co-sponsor. And I have the tickets available through Eventbrite, and I am charging a nominal fee. It's not making me rich. It's giving me some dancing money. We can talk about polka dancing another time, but I'm charging a little bit of a fee so that people don't register and then not show up, because these are limited. I only let in a small number of people because the majority of this is Q&A. I have an expert who, we may talk a little bit, but this is not a webinar. It's definitely Q&A. We talk about some things. I'll ask questions. People ask questions. It's kind of a free for all, but it's kind of fun.
Yeah.
And my experts are just really great at fielding questions, and
they know their stuff.
So it's a lot of fun. 2 hours Central Time, noon to 2 is how it goes. So on Valentine's Day, you can come and learn about hunting rights. Oh my gosh, is that ever a mystery to people? Do you post no hunting signs if you don't want hunting? If you do want hunting, how do you handle it? Do you charge for it? Does the renter get to do anything they want? What about trespassing? How, if somebody's shot something and it's come across the fence, what do you do? How do you have to let them in, or what's the law? So the woman I have who's presenting had 30 years as a conservation officer in Iowa, and then she was a conservation officer supervisor, and she's got loads of stories. She's got a lot of good information, but I talked her into telling one of her best stories. So we'll do that. And then I have a woman who is fabulous with, we're calling it mysterious wildlife, but it's the things that we need in the environment, but you don't necessarily know that maybe you've done something that harms a salamander population in the woodlands, or turtles, or even the rodents that the other things need to live on that trophic level. If you want, you've got to have some of those things. So she's really, really good with everything from salamanders to woodchucks to bats to whatever. So she's going to talk about all that mysterious wildlife and the habitat, and how can you make sure that you're not doing something that harms them. And then we've got a woman who's going to talk about land transitioning and how do you pass forward that land? What are the tax implications? So her strength is tax law. And so she's going to field questions from people that are curious about, trusts and revocable trusts. She's not a lawyer. We're not dishing legal advice, but sometimes people just need to learn what the terms are and what maybe some options are. And geez, my folks did this. Should I do that too? Or is there a better instrument out there? And people need to practice the terminology.
Yeah.
And then the last one is, gosh, it was a lot of fun last time. There are soil tests that are newish, that are different. So the soil tests most people have done, either garden variety or the local co-op or ag service comes out and samples the land and sends it in for test. That's 60-year-old technology. Now, I don't take any personal affront at that, but it's old technology. And there's a newer technology that's called the Haney test. And I think it has a lot of benefit for landowners, not just farmers. It tells you a lot about your soil and how is it doing and are we improving it or not? And how can we look at making improvements and making changes? Yes, it's helpful for the farmer. Yes, there's good stuff. But we're going to talk to a woman who does this for a company, and she's going to explain the Haney test, Haney, Haney test, and it's amazing. So we'll look at real data, analyze, pick through all of the bits and pieces, and talk about if you were a landowner and you hadn't done STEM science education, how do you make meaning out of that stuff, and what numbers could you watch and watch them change over time? Maybe you take it 1 year as a baseline, and then 3 years later you take it again, and then 5 years later you take it again. I mean, there are different ways of working with that so that you can tell whether your land is getting better or not.
Yes.
So
yeah. Well, so be sure to send those dates and maybe a little bio about the thing, and I'll be sure to include it in the some notes with this. I love the phrase "women caring for the land." That sounds wonderful. And the Haney test. Okay. Well, I think that's kind of a wrap. I don't know if you've got more things you wanted to share, or how maybe you could, a lot of people that do these little.
I could go on ad nauseum.
Yeah.
So,
but I wanted to just say how, how would people get a hold of you if they wanted?
I do have a website, eResources Group, and I also put out a little newsletter. I almost hate to even call it a newsletter because it's just kind of a humble little email. I don't have time to write a newsletter. It's not pretty, and then I don't always have any graphics, and it's just like writing it kind of like I'm talking to you, because you need to know this, and I've seen this, and I've learned this thing. And so I put that out. I call it Kibbles and Tidbits for life. And through my email address on the website, you can ask to be added to the Kibbles and Tidbits. You have to ask, and you have to ask to get off, because I don't have a fancy subscription list. It's, it's just me. And I don't take offense if somebody wants off, because Lord knows we all get too much email. So
yeah, really.
So I put that out, and that's where I also advertise any of the upcoming workshops. I'm playing around with some other possibilities in my head that I think would be fun. So yes, I'm happy to share the information about the upcoming workshops and any additional ones.
Great. Well, Jean, thank you so much for your time and your hard work in all of this.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, me too, to have met you and found out about all this. So it's great.
Good.
So we'll keep in touch and we'll see where this goes.
Very good.
All right. Well,
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Jean, you take care.
All right.
All right. Bye-bye. Have a nice rest of your day.
You too.
All right.